Hello and welcome. This is 60 Seconds with Diego Segura. Are you ready?
Yeah, I mean, 60 seconds is all I've got.
I want you to answer whatever first thing that comes to mind. Just answer.
Oh, these are rapid fire?
Oh, yeah.
Oh, shit.
Are we ready?
Can
Let's
I
go.
cuss? I'm not going to cuss.
Best restaurant in New York.
Ooh. Dudley's. My
What?
personal favorite. I know that's not probably the best in the world, but I go there all the time. I'm a regular.
Oh, I love that. Most frustrating app.
Be real.
Good. Least favorite color.
Ooh. Probably a purplish pink.
Favorite brand right now.
Teenage engineering, probably?
Favorite design agency right now.
Collins. But only because I'm paid to say
Do I look like a rat or a fish?
that.
Choose carefully.
You resemblant. You look like you could have come from the same sort of family. You know what I mean? Like at some point in the branch of evolution, maybe you guys are far apart now, but you could have been.
Like both rat and fish?
No. You could have been related to him somehow, but you're not anymore. You're not anymore, Sean.
All right, city everyone should know about that isn't New York.
A city?
Mm.
Oh, you should all know about Cedar Park, Texas.
Wow.
Okay.
All right.
Mostly just because that's where I grew up. There's absolutely nothing there. There's nothing worth knowing, right?
And that's why we should go.
But it's kind of relevant, right? Like, clearly there are good designers coming out of Cedar Park, Texas these days, right?
We're going to get into that.
Before that, none.
Love that.
I'm sure there were like 5 good ones.
And one more. What's your career in a noise?
Career in a noise?
Yeah.
I can't make a meep. How do you do a meep?
You tell me.
A meep. Like a very high pitch.
Like a meep. Meep. Love that.
That's my career in a noise. It's very baby-ish.
And we're in.
Okay,
Diego,
great.
welcome. I'm actually so excited to have you on today.
Yeah.
We met how long ago? Maybe 6 months?
Something like that.
Yeah, something like
Maybe
that.
longer.
And I was really excited to meet you because you are the head of design and co-founder at a place called Nation.
Was I that when we met?
Yeah.
Really?
Yeah, you were. Yeah.
Really? So when did I meet Woody?
May? April? When we came over last time, yeah.
Okay.
Maybe that's not 6 months. I can't really do maths.
Yeah, that's fine.
But anyway, I want to know a bit. First question, I guess. We'll come on to Nation. But first question is, who was the first person that made you feel like you had talent?
First person that made me feel like I had talent. I guess in my career, it was probably... In my career, it was the first guy who hired me when I was 17. He ran a tech startup. His name is David Self. Shout out, David, if you're watching. There are some people at that first internship that are completely written out of the history of what I did there, that were not very kind, not very encouraging, in some cases just like toxic. And this guy, David, who kind of ran the company and operated it, was the first person, one, who got me in the door and said, you seem interesting, you have a cool story, come intern with us. But two, while I was there, he spent tons of time teaching me. And I would just stay at the office super late, as I've done at every single job I've ever had. And I would just look for the most senior people in the room and ask them questions. And David answered every single one of them. And he was the one who kind of put me on to, he was the one who told me what Collins was. I didn't know even that design agencies existed. I thought you could just work as a designer at a company. I was so naive.
Yeah.
He was the one who sort of put me on to a lot of knowledge, but also told me, like, you could go work at a place like Collins. And I remember him telling me that.
Really?
And I just thought, no, I don't think I could. He's like, why not? You can go anywhere. You're a salesperson. You could find a way to, to get there even if you don't have the credentials.
So
he believed in me a lot.
So you found about Collins through him?
Yeah.
Wow.
Because he showed me the MailChimp rebrand.
Interesting.
And then he went down the rabbit hole that I think most people do when they find out these cool brand firms. He said, oh, they did the MailChimp rebrand, they did Spotify, they did Dropbox. And then he showed me the whole website, and I was like, oh my God, this is all so cool. This is the design work I want to be doing.
Love
and then he told me I should go work there.
So let's talk a bit more about that. I want to hear about the story of, you're from Texas, right?
Yeah.
Collins aren't in Texas last time I checked.
No, they're not.
How did that come about?
Let's see. Yeah, I guess the short of it was I always wanted to I always wanted to take as different a path as possible
Mm.
from the time I was a kid. So I knew early on that I wasn't going to go to college. So instead, when I was 16, I started writing a book called The Dropout Manifesto. And I wrote it, drafted it, shared it with English teachers to get their notes on it, hired a copy editor
Wow.
from like Upwork, who ended up being a great editor, and worked with them on the book. And then I self-published this book on Amazon. Of course, I was able to design it because I taught myself InDesign. Or actually, I don't think at the time I knew InDesign. I think I made that book in Apple Pages
No way.
and then made the cover in Illustrator
Yeah.
because I barely knew how to use Illustrator. I might not have even been using Illustrator at the time. I might have been using Affinity. What is it called? Affinity Designer?
Oh,
Something
God,
like that?
That's real. Because I was a designer, as you know
Yeah.
before. Illustrator is all I knew.
Yep.
InDesign was too much for me. Too many guidelines.
Yeah, that's a whole other story. When
Yeah.
I got to Collins and they were like, "Yeah, you're gonna have to work in InDesign," I was like, "Shit, dude, I did not do this course." But anyway, I made that book, self-published it, and I started reaching out to people with that as a premise of saying, "This is my project. I can do design work. I remember at some point I did like 100 logos in 100 days, where I would just make one every
Wow.
day with a friend of mine called Bryce. Um, Bryce and I still work together, so that's really cool. All these short few years later, I don't get the thing where I can go, oh my God, back in the day,
Yeah.
back in the early 2000s when I first discovered design, right? But that was kind of my path in. Is like I didn't want to take a traditional path in anywhere, and graphic design was a very I don't want to say easy, but it was at least a quick and clear way where I could start making money as a teenager. Because by the time I was 11 or 12, I was already doing thumbnails for people on YouTube. Like that was my entrance into design.
Yeah.
And then later on, I started reading the books and discovering that there were, firms that did certain things. Like I said, that David told me about. I remember reading Logo Design Love, Brand Identity by Alina Wheeler, those sort of books. How To by Michael Beirut, like the standard books that you start getting into in design, and then learning the craft from there.
That's cool. Because I guess what I want to know is, and I'm struggling to understand, is because you dropped out of school, right?
Yeah.
And you thought, I'm going to try and break into arguably the best design agency in the world.
Yeah, well, it took me a couple months before I dropped out of school and then discovered that the best design firms even existed.
Okay.
So I was pretty naive when I dropped out. I didn't even know that design school was a thing. I didn't know RISD, SVA, Parsons. I didn't know any of these names. Art Center. Had no idea any of these things existed. So after a couple months after dropping out, it was kind of like, well, I guess you figure it out now. You learn now that these things exist, and you know now that these big firms exist. So I guess try and break in. See if you can figure it out.
Yeah. And tell me about that story. Brian Collins, how do you even get through to a man like that when you're 17?
You use your age to your advantage,
Okay.
right? And you say that you're, basically a child who's interested in design. It was really interesting. I knew that at that time, being so young was a real advantage, because if today I got an email from a 24-year-old designer who has a lackluster portfolio and says they want to work at Nation, it's going to be way more difficult for me to find time for that versus if someone who's 16, 17, 18 says they're a high school student and has written a book and self-published it, even if their portfolio is terrible, it's still remarkable that you're doing that sort of work, or you're pushing yourself to do that sort of work at such a young age. So I knew that it was an advantage to be young. And so in a lot of the emails I wrote, and mind you, I wrote thousands of emails, literally thousands of emails to so many different firms, marketers, designers, creative directors, technologists. I was writing emails to everybody, just trying to get conversations. And Brian was one of those emails. Admittedly, it was one of the more bespoke emails. Sometimes I kind of copy-pasted my message and said, I'm young, I'm doing this, I published a book, I work on these sorts of projects, I'm interested in design. To Brian, it was a little bit more tailored, like, I want to work at Collins for these reasons. And he responded. I just got his email because I looked it up on the internet, and I think um, I used a couple different tools at the time. One of them was called Interstellar, which was now acquired by Greenhouse.
Okay.
And it was just one of these tools you could like find anybody's email. Just go to the domain name, right? wearecollins.com. And then it would kind of return you a list of email addresses that they've scraped the internet for, right? And so that's how I found
Real
Brian's
hustle
email.
way in, the sneaky
Yeah.
back door.
Oh yeah, there was another tool that I had to use in a command line, so I felt really hackerish just finding someone's email. It was really dope. I think that's written about in my book actually.
Yeah.
I think it's called The Harvester, which is hilarious. That it's still a tool that you can use. So that's how I reached out to Brian, and then he responded, and basically just started grilling me about design. He's like, "Well, why do you want to be a designer, and why do you want to work at Collins? There's a lot of different firms. You're in Texas. Why do you want to move to New York?" Like just making me clarify my thinking about why I was interested in certain things. And in doing that was a really valuable thing to do, because in writing down my thoughts and in being forced to articulate them to someone and in some way sell, right? Couldn't give a shitty answer. Oh, I'm interested in design because I think it's interesting. I knew that wasn't a good enough answer. I knew that I had to answer with the context of, well, I've read these things about design, and I think this is a good way to make change in an organization. Or even for me personally, knowing that design was a way into rooms that otherwise I might not get into, right? Especially brand design. Brand design is one of the few pieces of design that the CEO of every single company will at some point be in the room for. You're not going to change your logo or change your name without the CEO being in the room. It just doesn't happen, right? It can primarily live under a CMO, but I knew that design was a way into a boardroom. And that didn't mean designing banner ads. I knew that what Collins was doing wasn't what the advertising agencies were doing. I knew that they were doing something that great founders gave a shit about. And that's what excited me, a lot of it. And I'm sure I had other answers. In fact, you should reach out to Brian at some point. Brian and Katya at Collins, I promise you, they still have the original videos that I sent into Collins. Because at one point, Brian asked me a bunch of questions about design, and instead of writing answers, I sent in videos answering them.
No way.
Because I knew I was better at talking than I was writing. Or at least I knew that would have a better effect. And so there are videos of me as a 17, 18-year-old kid answering questions about design. And I sent them into Collins, and the creative directors I interviewed with watched those videos, and they were like, "Hey, pretty well spoken and seems to like have an okay portfolio.
Yeah.
Maybe he can come work for us." Which that is a funny experience, and also something that David Self, the first person who hired me, he taught me that. He's a great salesperson, a great closer, and he taught me, if you really want to get in and do the deal, you have to get your face in front of somebody. None of this internet shit, And if you can't get physically there, record a video. And then from recording a video, I was able to, get meetings scheduled with Brian and Nick and Tom and Leo and the amazing names who worked there at that time. So It was kind of it wasn't a quick journey, but
yeah,
it worked out. And then I got hired a couple months later.
And that's it. So we're not here now, but let's fast forward. First day at Collins comes. You're 18 at this point, right?
Yeah, I was 18.
18. Tell me about that. Is that imposter syndrome to the max? How are you feeling?
Well, I remember sitting in the Capital One above. So Capital One here in the States, I don't know if you have these in the UK, but Capital One is a bank that has a Pete's Coffee in most of their bank branches. Okay, so it's a little coffee shop and a bank. And I didn't know any cool coffee shops. I definitely didn't feel acquainted to New York at all. So the Collins office used to be at 88 University Place. Used to be. Which is actually a famed WeWork building where Adam Newman did some self-dealing. Fun fact. But anyway, besides the point. So the Collins office was at 88 University Place, right next to Union Square. I didn't want to show up too early, didn't want to show up too late. I was incredibly nervous. So I went and sat in the Capital One Pete's Coffee by Union Square, and I just sat for like 35 minutes because I was way too early, and then I just
I'm
realized
incredibly nervous.
Yeah, I was so nervous. I was sweating. It's the summer. It was June 3rd. June 3rd, 2019 or 18? 2018, I guess. No, it might have been 2019. June 3rd. It's hot. I'm sweating. I'm in, you know, I think I'm in black pants and like a black t-shirt, trying to look as designery as possible. Just so goddamn nervous. And then I show up and it was so anticlimactic because when I showed up, the director of resourcing wasn't even there yet. And so I'm there at like 10 on the dot. And I'm like, I'm looking for so-and-so. And they go, yeah, she's not here. Like she's probably not gonna be in here till like 10:45. I'm like, so what do I
I'll
do?
go back to Pete's Coffee then.
Yeah, but they gave me a desk. It was right in the corner, with a great view on a great window, which made me feel somewhat special because I was sat next to like just all the regular designers. I wasn't put in some intern desk because there were no interns at the time. It was just me and the Collins staff, all these people that I admired. And I was sitting next to Brian Chu, who's an amazing designer, Brian and Megan and Barney and Tom, and that was the people on my row. And I was just like, what the fuck is going on? And then I think one of the first things I did was I just like walked up to Brian Chu and I said, hey, Chu, because they told him don't call him Brian because there's, Brian Collins. Hey, Chu, can I like, shadow you for a little bit? Can I just watch what you're working on? I forget what he was designing, but yeah, I just watched over his computer screen and we just kind of talked through design. But I think it was mostly awkward silence.
Yeah.
It was mostly just Chu going, what is this kid doing here? Why is he here?
Why
And
is he
why am
right
I now
behind me?
babysitting him?
Yeah.
Right? And so I just turned the whole staff into my babysitters for a couple days until I started to get my bearings. It was a very weird first week. Very strange first 2 weeks. And not intentionally so. Just like, what do you do when an actual child shows up to a real world-class design studio and you don't know what to do with them? And you also don't know what they're capable of. Like, does he know how to design? Can he use the software? There was a lot of confusion in the first couple weeks of people trying to give me tutorials. And I was like, oh, I know that. And then I would actually say, like, there's actually a shortcut to do that. But not in a rude way. Just like, yeah, there's a shortcut that you can do it this way. I'm like, oh shit, I didn't know that, dude. And then Leo Porto was the first one who caught on to that. And he said, wait a second, you already know this. Why am I teaching you? And I was like, I don't know. Like, there's got to be stuff that I don't know. He was like, sure, yeah, but like overall, you can do it yourself. Like, I can teach you along the way, but I don't need to baby you through it. And then he handed me some guidelines to finish. And I was like 10 days into this job.
Oh, wow.
I had done nothing. And I was like, Leo, I don't think that's a good idea. And he was like, no, you can do it. It's perfectly fine. Why not? I was like, okay. And then he gave me the guidelines and I finished them. Of course, he helped me out. And he would just check in on me in the morning and in the afternoon before he left. And then I was working on actual projects. But Leo was the first one who just kind of handed me some of his work. Didn't tell anybody, notably.
Really?
Didn't tell anybody that he was giving me the work. And then slowly but surely, people started to figure out that Diego was actually working on things and that you could ask me for help on your project. And then I would just take on whatever menial task you needed, whether that was guidelines or photoshopping something on a case study. He figured out that I knew the software already and I didn't really have to be taught, at least in that department. I just needed to be creative directed like a regular associate designer. And that I'm really thankful for. If it wasn't for that, I think I'd have been gone in like 3 months. But since I got to actually work, stuck around for 3 years. So that was good.
Wow. That's awesome. And then, so was it at Collins that you decided, because you decided early that you want to potentially start your own thing. When did that decision come around? When did that thought go through your head?
Well, the thought came into my head as a child because I wanted to be like the cool founders, aka Steve Jobs. Now, I didn't understand there were other founders as a child, right? I just knew that I really loved my iPod Touch as a 9-year-old, okay, which ages me because 9 years old with an iPod Touch, you guys are starting to think, wait a second. I was not 9 when the iPod Touch came out, right? I don't actually remember when the iPod Touch came
No,
out,
neither.
but it was something like that. So I was like 8 or 9 years old with an iPod Touch that Apple sent to me free of
No.
charge. An 8 gigabyte second generation iPod Touch, I think, that Apple sent to me because I wrote them a letter as a little kid, okay, that said, I love our Mac. We have an iMac. My mom has an iPhone. I like to play racing games on this iPhone. And I like to use our Mac because I think it's beautiful. And I sent this letter to Apple because it was my mom's coworker had a partner who worked at Apple. So I sent this letter in. I'm like 7 at the time. And then they sent me back an iPod
No.
Touch. Swear to you. That was like a $200 value at the time. Okay. If you include the booklight, $215, that's a Snuggie joke. So yeah, so the iPod Touch came in, and that really changed my whole existence because then I started getting into technology and I would research like Apple. Who's working on Apple? You learn about Steve Jobs. You learn about Steve Wozniak. You learn about, I used to watch all the WWDC keynotes, the Worldwide Developers Conference. I knew who Phil Schiller was. I knew who Scott Forstall was. I definitely knew who Johnny Ive was, right? So these were the names that were bubbling around in my head. And as a kid, then I already had kind of decided, well, this is the world I want to be in. I want to make companies. I want to make products. I want to design things. Though I didn't understand the discipline that was design yet. I didn't know that there was design school. I definitely didn't know that there was a difference between industrial design or product design or graphic design or brand design. And I sure as hell didn't know what brand strategy was. I didn't know that until I got to Collins. 3 months in, I met Dash Allison and actually started figuring out what she did every day, right? So the naive wish to start a company started very early. And then to actually go start one in reality happened only 9 months ago. And that was just because a good friend of mine and now my co-founder, Ryan Shea, who also wanted to work at Collins, did not get the job. All up to him. It worked out for him. He did not get the job, though. I flew out twice to Collins in New York and sealed the deal because, that's what you're taught to do as a closer. When the first person who hires you is a salesperson, that's what you learn to do. Ryan did not do that, but he ended up working at Solana Labs, which is an awesome organization with tons of talent. And, of course, Solana became one of the more valuable blockchains in the world. And then we had been in touch on a lot of different ambitions of ours. We're the same age. And we figured it was the time to start a company. We knew we could raise. And then we got a team together, started making a product and raising. And it just kind of happened. It kind of happened unbeknownst to even me. Before I knew it, I'd quit my job at another tech company called Waybridge. Before I knew it, I'd quit my job, and now we were raising money, and we had a team working for us. And that's where we are now. Now, what happens after that? Good goddamn question. No clue.
Yeah. That's cool. So, what's Nation in its most simplest form?
In its simplest form, without explaining tech, it's the next generation of how communities are going to organize. And adding in a little bit of tech to that, of course, it's a Web3 company. So there's a lot of stigma around what is Web3, what's not Web3, what's crypto good for, is crypto a sham? The basic of what Nation aims to do is to give people the tools to turn their communities into small enterprises, right? And do something that has actual impact in the world. So imagine taking a subreddit of people that are excited about, shoes and having them do some collective purchase of a very rare sneaker drop that otherwise they couldn't have gotten alone, or doing their own production runs of shoes, right? It's very Kickstarter-esque, but in the sense that a bunch of people can get together. The added layer on top of that is where everybody kind of gets a stake in the community and is able to use tokens, use Web3 primitives like NFTs, fungible tokens, all that technology. Hopefully, they'll do that seamlessly, so they won't have to think about the fact that they're using Web3. It'll just happen. But through all of those things, they'll have ownership in the community and ownership in the projects that they're a part of, and hopefully do things that are a little bit more high touch than just posting, ship posting on Reddit together or talking on a Discord.
You mentioned about the stigma of Web3.
Yeah.
Do you feel like you get a lot of people just not understanding what it is you really do?
Yes, if I talk about technology.
Okay.
If I don't talk about technology, and it depends on who you talk to in Web3, right? Because sometimes people only want to talk tech, which I think is okay um, if you're talking to other engineers. So if I go to one of the Solana hacker houses and I tell them about our DAO tooling platform and how we're improving UX, they don't find that an odd sentence.
Mm.
They think that makes sense. If I tell my mom that,
Yeah.
she goes, "That sounds really cool. And I love you and I'm
Yeah.
proud of you." And that's about it. And she doesn't ask any further questions because she's already intimidated by the language.
Mm.
And so people do get confused, but I think that's only a symptom of me not being good at explaining it sometimes. And it's also a symptom of the technology being nascent and how this is going to work being unclear, right? How does a DAO, decentralized autonomous organization, how does that really impact how communities will organize in the future? The truth is that that's not clear yet. We have early examples of DAOs that have done interesting things, but at Nation, we're trying to figure out how that scales and how does that reach every single person on the planet? How does that infiltrate even the most mundane of book clubs, if at all, right?
Mm.
So it's twofold. If you talk about technology, people really get confused, but also it's unclear how this stuff is really going to impact the entire world. And it has a lot of promise, but there's going to be like 7 different stories on how a DAO might impact someone's life, or how Nation might impact someone's life. And that's just unclear. It's not like getting to work on a branding assignment where the company's been around for 10 years and is already worth $500 million in the public market, let alone a private market valuation of like $8 billion, where you get to work on these crazy, amazing companies that already found product market fit.
Yeah.
So it's a totally different mindset than what I got to do at Collins, which was help successful businesses better define themselves.
Mm.
This is helping a non-existent business become something that people don't even know exists.
Yeah. So you speak to a lot of CEOs, founders, I imagine, investors, right?
Yeah.
Do you ever feel that you're almost discriminated for your age?
Yeah, it's not explicit always, but there is a difference, and it depends on the room. It also depends on the industry. It depends on the type of company. So if I'm in a VC's office and I'm brash and I'm loud and I have opinions about design and tech, and maybe I'm even a little out of pocket about those opinions and hold those strongly, they're not even opinions at a certain point. They're convictions about how a company should work. That's not seen as a bad thing, right? In fact, a VC might write you a $2 million check just for that.
But why? Because traditionally, there's a certain way to do it, right? There's a
Right.
certain process you need to adhere to.
But
what
that's
makes
not
this
where
different?
venture money is made, right?
Yeah.
So, of course, being in an agency, that's a little different. Or being in a larger tech company. Now, mind you, I've never worked in a company that had more than 50 people in any of the jobs that I've had, or at least divisions that had more than 50 people. So I've always worked in smaller organizations. And again, depends on the industry, depends on the size. But like, I would imagine if you're in a large corporation and you want to change an entire tech stack, that takes months and months and months of meetings just to change one product maybe, or one idea or concept or operating principle of how the company works, because, well, the company makes a lot of money, so why would we change anything? Versus venture money isn't made by doing the same thing over and over. Now, on the agency side, there is money made in doing things differently. So if you're at a place like Collins and you do something that can be related to another project that Collins has done, there is hell to pay, right? And I think most agencies would share this attitude, or at least most agencies should have that attitude. That if they do the same work that they did for the last project, that should be frowned upon, because your idea is to differentiate. If you're a branding agency, you sell differentiation.
Yeah.
So if you do the same thing over and over, then that's a bad thing. That said, it often only applies to design, visuals, or even thinking. Because how many times have we seen a strategy deck that says the word human in it? That's not differentiated. That's just doing something that sounds good and maybe makes the client who sells dish soap feel like they do something slightly more interesting than they do. They don't. But people still do that and then call it differentiated thinking. And so there's, with that attitude, that's also the sort of place. Now, mind you, I've worked in really great agencies like Collins. A lot of this is hearing from experience of people at different agencies, different companies, different industries entirely. But in a company like that, and I've taken meetings with companies like that, that maybe aren't as open to innovation, they're definitely not going to be open to you being a child. Because in that mind space, your fresh thinking or even your naivete, if that's how you pronounce that word,
however you want to do it,
if you're naive, that's a bad thing. Versus, I think to a lot of VCs, if you ask them, hey, this founder's a little naive, they have a really good idea, they're young, they're really driven, but they're a little naive on what's it going to take. That's actually an advantage, right? And I think even for the way I'm hiring for Nation's team, it's like I want people that are a little naive about how they're going to make a transition from graphic design into product design, for example. Whether or not they're a child at 18, being hired at 18 to work in a very grown-up agency, right? Whether or not they're actually young or if they're 34 trying to make a transition, that youthfulness to me is a good thing. But I've definitely felt it where people just don't think that if you're young that you have the experience that it takes. They don't think that if you haven't worked on 6 of these projects before, then clearly you couldn't possibly be good at it. And that's a terrible feeling. Terrible, terrible feeling, especially when you start to work on it and then do as good work as anybody else, or at least competitive work. And then you really the illusion really starts to crack of why is this person so much more senior to me?
Yeah. Experience is an interesting thing, isn't it? It's like, people see it so objectively in number of years or whatever it is, but I guess it's what you do in those years that is really what should define experience.
There's also momentum involved.
Tell me more about that.
Right? So if you've been working for 3 years at a high-powered agency, your momentum is guiding you to some of the best work of your career. But if you worked 3 years at one of the high-powered agencies and then spent 3 years at Google just sitting in a nap pod, numbing your mind to all things creative and only using red, green, blue, and yellow, you're probably not going to be doing the best work of your career at that time. You could have done amazing work, and then you could have gone in a dip that really, threw you out of that loop of high creativity, right? Or high innovation, or even just high drive. And that's okay. I think there's different stages that people are in, right? If you're 33 and you have 2 kids and a partner and also an ailing parent, you have things going on, definitely work at your design agency is not that important compared to your family. And that's totally okay. But I do think it's worth acknowledging that people are in different stages. Right? And if you have the momentum, you should probably be put on as crazy projects as possible because you're in that stage where the next project you do might be absolutely killer because you've been pushing yourself on each project further and further and further. Nothing to say about burnout there. Like, again, it's all depending on the person, but momentum's a huge thing, way more than age.
Yeah. Diego Segura, I want to know.
Oh, God.
What are you at?
So I thought about this because Ollie asked me this the other day. Okay.
Oh, okay.
And I like this question a lot. Mostly what I've realized it is in the last couple of days, I've really been thinking about this like every day for the last 3-4 days. What am I really, really bad at and what do I want to get better at? And it directly ties into what we were just talking about. In my head, if I want to get better at something, I'll just go read a book. Or if I want to learn about something, I'll just go read a book. So I got kind of obsessed with the idea of opening a nightclub at some point. So I went and read a bunch of books. I read about Peter Gatien and The Limelight and Palladium and Club USA and Tunnel and started intellectualizing this idea of what it means to open a nightclub or work in nightlife in New York. Or if I wanted to get into Web3, you go start reading all the essays, right? You go read the white papers and you go read this and you go read that. And while that's a kind of a good habit, it really fucks you over when you're trying to do something new and when you're trying to do something fast. And so I have a really bad habit of going too deep into the thinking part about, well, let me think about how I might do this. Let me think about what this will look like. Let me articulate it fully before I do anything. And what happens is then I don't do anything. Or I don't actually get in touch with someone that I probably should, who would give me an even better answer. I just stay comfortable in reading mode. And reading mode doesn't get anything done. Right? And I think it is kind of a bad habit that I picked up from having so much time to really strategize. In an agency, you don't really have to see the work through to completion. You just do the strategy work, do the design work, and at some point it gets passed off to somebody. And if it gets passed off and it doesn't get executed on, then who gives a shit? That's their problem, which is not the right way to think about work. And so I think in that sense, I got really comfortable with just intellectualizing the things I want to do or the things I'm interested in and not getting the rubber to hit the road fast enough. Which sounds like one of those like kind of non-answers, like, oh, so you're really good at being smart and reading. It's like, no, it's an actual problem. Because if you go read about someone who made, let's use Peter Gatien as an example, if you go read how he started his nightclubs, there was no book. There was no Peter Gatien playbook. There was no book that he could read and say, well, this is how you start a nightclub empire that lasts for 18 years in one of the hardest locales on the entire planet to start nightclubs. There's no book for that. So clearly he just did it. And he didn't need all these books. There's also quotes about this that people will talk about how Plato or Socrates or any of these people had access to not even 2% of the total information that we have access to on the internet. So is it all the reading that they did that made them great, or did they just get down and start fucking writing? Did they start doing things? Did Marcus Aurelius have to read all day to figure out how he was going to be an emperor, or did he do emperor shit and therefore learn? And that's a really bad habit that now that I'm in the tech world, I have to force myself out of. And to the VCs watching, if you're watching VCs, I'm getting better at it. Don't you worry.
They will be.
Right?
Oh, yeah.
So it's an execution first mindset. But it's really hard to get out of because when you start getting to executing and when you start getting to talking to customers, that's when you open yourself up for all sorts of rejection. And you just have to steel yourself against that. And I hate rejection. I hate failing. I hate feeling like I didn't do it exactly right or do it at the highest level. So I guess in some way the answer to that question is I'm really bad at not over-intellectualizing things, but I'm also really bad at accepting the fact that I'm just going to be shit for a while, or I'm not going to know the answer, or I'm going to be terrible at something, and therefore it's stopping me from doing anything that would force me into failure.
So when's the first time you felt rejected in this industry?
Ooh, the first 998 emails, right? Like I sent so many outreach emails to just different designers, marketers, and founders, and a lot of people just didn't respond. And I started to realize that people have busy lives and they don't really give a shit about some kid who's reaching out that wants to learn about their career. And so it was a constant barrage of rejection at that time. I was literally 16 writing emails, scheduling meetings in the middle of my school day. I would be in science class and just walk out on my phone because I had a call scheduled because I was already on that Google Calendar stuff. Right, you're not supposed to discover Google Calendar when you're 16. That's a little too young, right? You're not supposed to be on Google Calendar. But I had all these calls scheduled. But then I would get on some of these calls, and the people who took the calls tended to be more gracious. But that was also after 15 emails that said, hey, sounds great, but not interested, too busy, don't have time, don't know what you do, have no use, don't want graphic designers, all sorts of different ways of saying, like, no. Yeah. I don't want to talk to you. Yeah. Which is fine. I did take it personally sometimes. And there were certain emails that I really wanted to get responses back from. I really wanted to get a response back from so-and-so, designer, who never responded. I'm not going to call it those people because I got responses from most people. But that sucked. And of course, that's pretty much just sales. That's just like business development in outreach. I had to really get used to people not giving a shit about my story. But then my instinct was to go read about storytelling and read about sales and read about writing for sales and reading about any way that I could convince people to actually take a conversation with me.
Mm.
So in some way, just putting myself out there forced me to get better at articulating what I wanted or how someone could help me, or more importantly, how I could help someone else, which is, I think, is how I got that first internship, offering up my time to design and write for them, and help them market their company. You know?
Awesome. So I want to just touch on talent really quickly, because you've essentially gone from agency, studio lifestyle to tech in-house. Yes. What are tech companies offering that agencies aren't to attract creative talent?
Money. Money and equity is a huge part. I think that conversation, if not addressed off the bat, is intellectually dishonest. Agencies don't pay well. That's okay. That's a business model. Agencies don't pay well. Early stage tech companies pay slightly better. Maybe the base salaries aren't as big as Facebook, Amazon, Apple, Netflix, Google, Microsoft, but there's equity involved too. So in the case of a 2-year or a 3-year vesting schedule, just after a 1-year cliff, you could have a big chunk of that company, especially if you're like a founding designer. And I know plenty of designers who have the talent to be a principal designer at one of these tech companies. Either they haven't been introduced or they don't run in the same circles, because the New York design agency world is not heavily overlapped with the San Francisco tech world in a lot of cases. Now there's a burgeoning, tech scene in New York, but there's like the stereotype that it's all fintech, and you can imagine that great graphic designers and designers in general maybe aren't super excited about fintech. But either way, there's some issue that these circles don't overlap enough. And so a lot of designers are in agencies only because I guess maybe they think that's the only option to do the type of work that they want to do. So the tech companies offer, a blank slate with a lot of money and often big budgets to do kind of whatever you want and to own more of the work. That said, on the other side, the agencies offer a great structure that has done good work for the past 10, 15 years, that if you want to do a great advertising campaign, it's a pretty easy structure to get that done. Everybody knows how to do it. You have producers, you have copywriters, art directors, photographers, videographers, models. Everybody's involved. And so there's structures that allow you to do the work that you want to do.
On that, we talk a lot about creating purposeful work and having variety, right? As a designer. Do you lose that going into a tech company? Or what about
define purposeful?
Purposeful that is genuinely adding value to an end user.
Yeah, okay. Under that definition, I think in tech you have way more of an opportunity to do that. Way more. Because the truth is that if you're at a brand design agency and your deliverable is guidelines, and you think that you had a massive impact on a company with 250 pages worth of what not to do with the logo, you're wrong. You did not add value. You might have helped a marketing scheme, and that's great, and you might have increased sales a couple bips. But you did not change the core of what made that company successful. And especially if you did a rebrand after a company was already successful, they're already $1 billion company, and then you did the rebrand, you are not responsible for the next $1 billion. Financiers were responsible for the next $1 billion. And maybe the next $4 billion were decided by some product managers and engineers who made something innovative that added to the product line and added to the bottom line. So I think there's a real disconnect between what sort of work do you do agency-wise and how does that actually get executed and who's actually using it. And that frustrated the living hell out of me. There was one project in particular that I won't name that had the most beautiful case study. It was one of my favorite projects that Collins had done. And by the time I worked at Collins, we ended up doing another project for that company, which I presented to them like 4 months in. I was still 18 years old. They had no idea. I presented to their CEO solo because the creative director wasn't there that day. And the creative director said to the account manager, Diego, you can design this. You can present this. And I was like, I definitely can't. And he was like, yes, you can. You can present this. Go with the account manager and do it solo. So that was cool. Small project. But anyway, that company, their website, complete shit compared to the case study. And when it had launched, the case study looked just like the website. And then they changed it up because they didn't know how to manage that as a client. And they didn't have the talent to do that. And that made me incredibly sad. And that was immediately when I started questioning why was I doing something that got destroyed so easily on the client side, and how could I keep it alive? How could I keep great design alive if not working at the tech companies? And the truth is that if you're not on a retainer, you're probably not helping that much on the design side.
Yeah.
So you just have to go. You have to go in-house at some point. At some point, if you really want to have that impact. If you just care about padding your portfolio, then you stay in design agencies forever. And that's a perfectly valid thing to do. Perfectly valid. And I also think there's a handful of projects that have major change of a company, but most of them do not, if we're being honest.
Okay. Well, Diego, I want to wrap up with something that we do every time on the podcast. You might have had a little look through before.
Yeah.
We call it elephant vomit. What do you think of that name? Do you love that?
I don't get the name elephant vomit. I'm going to keep it real with you.
Just imagine what elephant vomit must be like. You
It's
can't
gotta be
like
terrible.
that, right? You
Gotta
can't.
be terrible.
So that's why this
probably looks like mashed potatoes.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, we don't.
You a big fan of mashed potatoes?
I've got to be. I'm British.
Really?
I pretended most of my life.
That's a hot take I have. I can't do mashed potatoes. If someone held a gun to my head and said eat mashed potatoes, I'd say goodbye to my family.
If ever we fall out, you know what I'm bringing.
Yeah, exactly.
So this is a time where you got to bring something that you absolutely hate.
Yes.
Right? Might be within the industry.
Yes.
Creative industry. Might not be.
Yeah.
What is it?
Ooh, that I absolutely hate. You know what I'm going to do? I wrote down some possibilities.
Oh, I like this.
Okay, because there are a lot of things that I may or may not have some opinions on. And I'm not going to discuss all of them. Okay?
I'm ready to get into it.
A couple things. I'm going to rapid fire. I hate bad digital hygiene. If you're not cleaning up your desktop, do not work for me. Okay? Why is your desktop such a mess? Ian's over there on his laptop right now, scared to death because his desktop is a mess, dude. I can feel it from over here, okay? So I can't stand
like
that.
overlapping files.
Overlapping files, no folders. Like, you don't have Dropbox installed.
Oh.
Like, get something going, dude. He's closing his laptop.
Yeah, he's
Thank
done.
God. Don't let me see
Needs
it,
to go
okay?
get a new one.
Yeah. Bad digital hygiene is as elephant vomit.
Yeah.
Okay? That's a good one. Also, not using your keyboard shortcuts. That's a small thing. That's specifically for designers. If you are moving the mouse, okay, to design anything, you're crazy. And I don't know how you have a job in this industry because you must be moving faster, right? I don't know how people move this slow, but that's just a pet peeve of mine. And by the way, every single person I worked with at Collins taught me crazy amounts of keyboard shortcuts, and I think that's like a quarter of their success at least. Okay?
Wow.
They move crazy fast. Those designers over there are just banging out work, command option,
just
slaying
that
everything.
thumb on command is
it's insane, dude. It's insane. Okay, so that really intimidated me when I just saw screens flashing everywhere. That was awesome. So I hate people who don't do their keyboard shortcuts. Let's see. Ooh, this is a good one. I think this one's actually my serious answer. I really don't enjoy when designers don't want to learn about anything other than design. Which you probably get a thread throughout the whole podcast here. That there's a lot of talent in the industry that if they just read a couple blog posts a week about the tech world, they could engross themselves in this world, make nearly twice as much money, get equity grants at some of the hottest tech companies in the world, and do killer work that far outstrips any of these product designers who have worked in tech for 10 years and they're like, well, I know how to do a design system. And it's like, well, it's not creative and it's not interesting, but God bless you that you can do it. There's so much talent that just hasn't forced themselves out of the box of what they want to learn or what they're actually interested in, or hasn't even really reassessed, like, okay, I love design, I love writing, I love strategy. Now what do I want to do with that? And that makes me terribly sad. And it really it turns me off sometimes when you get engrossed in these conversations with people that really they don't want to step out of the box. And I think it would do so many people so much good to just learn something other than design. I've always believed that design cannot be a solo practice. It has to be, I'm a designer working on something else. I'm a designer who's interested in this. I'm a designer who does something in that. Because if you think about it, what's Apple? They're a tech company. And the public markets name them a tech company. And investors will call them a tech company because ultimately that's what makes them crazy valuable. But Apple didn't win because of their tech per se. Apple's a design company that happened to make computers. That's it. And the best car companies, Tesla, is a design company that happened to make a car. And Teenage Engineering, if you don't know what Teenage Engineering is, one of my favorite brands. They're a design company that happens to make music equipment. It's design always paired with some other practice. And with what I'm doing at Nation, I'm trying to be a designer who happens to work on Web3 tech. Because there's not a lot of designers, good designers, working in Web3, right? And if you can do that well, then I think there's value to be added. So more designers learning other shit would be great for everybody involved.
I love
everybody in the world.
I love that. And now our producer is furiously telling us to cut.
Nice.
Unfortunately, we've run out of time. But Diego, so good to see you again, man. It's been so much fun.
This was good.
All the best with Nation, obviously.
Thank you.
You guys are actually smashing it. We love it. And that's a wrap, I guess. Thank you.
Dude.